The smell hit me first. Not perfume exactly, something closer to cologne, faint and foreign, caught in the wool of her scarf as she unwound it by the front door. November air followed her inside, sharp and cold, and for a second I told myself it was just the night, just the street, the wind, someone she'd passed on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. I was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel, and I watched her hang the scarf on the hook without turning around, and I didn't say anything. "Good dinner?" I called. "Really good," she said. "Sorry I'm late. Parking was impossible." She finally turned and smiled at me, warm, easy, the same smile she'd aimed at me across 100 ordinary evenings, and I went back to the dishes. That was a Thursday in early October. Lily was already asleep. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets after a 6-year-old finally surrenders to bedtime, toys still scattered at the foot of the stairs, a juice cup left on the coffee table, the faint residue of noise in every room. I rinsed the last pan and set it in the rack and didn't think about the cologne again for almost 3 weeks. My name is Nathan. I was 38 years old that autumn, with a job I'd built carefully over 15 years, structural engineering for a mid-size firm that handled commercial builds across northeastern Ohio. I drove a truck I'd owned since before we were married. I coached Lily's Saturday soccer on alternate weeks. I grilled on Sundays even in cold weather, which Claire called compulsive and I called commitment. We had been married 9 years. 9 years is a particular kind of time. Long enough that you stop performing, short enough that you still remember who you were before. I knew Claire's sleep schedule better than my own. I knew she hummed the same 3 bars of a song she couldn't remember the name of while loading the dishwasher. I knew she cried at nature documentaries but never at human tragedies on the news, which she explained once as, "Animals don't choose to be in danger." I thought I knew her the way you know a house you've lived in, not consciously, but in your bones, in the dark, by feel. The year leading up to that October had been unremarkable by any measure I would have used then. Work was steady. Lily was thriving in first grade. Claire had picked up extra shifts at the dental office through summer and seemed lighter for it, more energized, more present at dinner. We'd taken a week in late July to drive up to Lake Erie and rent a cabin, the 3 of us, no itinerary, just water and trees and Lily collecting rocks she insisted were valuable. It was the kind of vacation that feels like a photograph while it's happening, already half nostalgic, already something you're planning to look back on. I looked back on it a lot, later. Trying to find what I'd missed. My cousin Derek had come to the 4th of July. He always came to the 4th of July, it was our tradition, or close enough to one. His parents lived 40 minutes outside Harrahfield and we'd grown up spending summers in the same orbit, fishing the same river, tolerating the same family holidays. Derek was 36, 2 years younger than me, a contractor who specialized in kitchen renovations and had a name people passed around on neighborhood Facebook groups as someone reliable. He was easy company. Funny. The kind of man who remembered your drink and brought it without being asked. He and Claire had always gotten along fine. I'd noticed it the way you notice weather, as a background condition, unremarkable, welcome even. A wife who gets along with your family is not a problem. It's something you're grateful for, quietly and without ceremony. I was grateful for it. That's the thing I keep turning over now. Gratitude as a form of blindness. The 4th was warm and loud and went until midnight. Derek stayed later than everyone else, which wasn't unusual. He and I had cracked a second 6-pack and sat on the back deck talking about a project he was bidding on, a restaurant build in Akron. Claire had come out twice to check on us, brought chips the second time, laughed at something Derek said that I missed. When he finally left, she leaned against me in the doorway and said, "He seems good lately." "Yeah," I said. "Happier." I didn't ask why she would know the difference. I should have asked. The scarf and its foreign smell faded into the general weather of October. Work buried me in permit revisions and a foundation dispute that dragged into 3 weeks of conference calls. Lily got a cold that became an ear infection. Claire's mother called twice in 1 week about something to do with a neighbor dispute I couldn't follow. Life had its ordinary weight, and I carried it the way I always did, steadily, with my head down, and I didn't notice the ground shifting beneath me. Not yet. But something had already started. The first thing I actually registered and filed, not registered and forgot, was the phone. Claire had always been relaxed about her phone. Left it on the counter, face up, didn't flinch when Lily grabbed it to look at photos, sometimes handed it to me to read a text while she was driving. In 11 years of being together, I had never once felt like her phone was a locked room. Sometime in mid-October, it became one. Not dramatically. There was no sudden privacy, no obvious guarding. It was subtler than that, the screen tilting slightly away when I came into the kitchen, the phone moved from the nightstand to the bathroom during her shower, a new habit of plugging it in across the room at night instead of beside the bed. Individually, each thing was nothing. Collectively, in the way that small rearrangements of furniture change the feeling of a room without you being able to say exactly how, something had shifted. I noticed, and I invented a reason for it. She was probably dealing with something personal, her mother, or a conflict at work she didn't want to unpack. Claire had a history of processing things internally before she talked about them. I respected that. I told myself I respected that. Looking back, I understand now that respect and avoidance are not the same thing. I had spent years calling the second one the first. We had dinner with her colleague Sandra that Friday, a standing monthly thing at a wine bar downtown that Claire liked and I tolerated pleasantly. Sandra was warm and voluble and talked at length about a patient she'd been treating who'd turned out to be a local city councilman, which Sandra found hilarious and Claire found concerning from a privacy standpoint. I watched Claire across the table, engaged, laughing, wineglass in hand, present in the way she always was in social situations, fully, generously, with genuine interest. She was good at rooms. She had always been good at rooms. But twice during the evening, her phone lit up and she flipped it face down without reading it. Sandra didn't notice. I noticed, and I told myself it was nothing. That was when I should have asked a question. Not an accusation, just a question. Who keeps texting? Easy. Natural. The kind of thing a husband says without weight. But I didn't ask, and the reason I didn't ask is the thing I've had to sit with the longest. I was afraid the answer would cost more than the silence. Derek called me that Sunday, actually called, which was unusual enough that I stepped off the deck to take it. He wanted to know if I could recommend a surveyor for a property his parents were thinking of selling. We talked for 20 minutes. Normal, easy. He asked about Lily. Asked if I was still coaching soccer. I said yes. He said he might come watch sometime, if the weather held. He didn't ask about Claire. I thought nothing of it at the time. Now I think about it constantly. Claire made chili that night, which was her cold weather ritual, a big pot on the stove that would last 3 days, the whole house smelling of cumin and tomato. Lily ate 2 bowls and fell asleep on the couch before 7, and Claire and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the radio on low and talked about nothing in particular, the roof, which needed one more inspection before winter, Lily's teacher, who'd sent home a note about a reading program, a weekend trip we'd been vaguely planning to Pittsburgh. All of it ordinary, all of it warm, all of it the texture of a life I believed in completely. She reached across the table and touched my hand at one point, just briefly, the way you do, and I turned my hand over and held hers, and she smiled at me with what looked exactly like contentment, and I felt something settle in my chest that I'd been carrying all week without knowing it. Whatever I'd half noticed, I let go of in that moment. That's the cruelest part of sustained deception, not the lie itself, but the intermittent truth woven through it. The moments of genuine warmth that make the suspicion feel paranoid, unworthy, small. You want so badly to be wrong that you accept the evidence for it without scrutiny. November arrived. The soccer season ended. I put the grill away. Lily started a phase of drawing portraits of everyone she knew, me, Claire, her teacher, the dog next door, our neighbor Mrs. Patton, and taping them to the refrigerator in a growing gallery that Claire and I added to ceremonially each time, pointing out details that Lily had captured with a 6-year-old's uncanny instinct, my truck in the background of my portrait, Claire's hair exactly right. It was a good month on its surface. A good marriage on its surface. And then Thanksgiving arrived. Derek came to Thanksgiving with his parents, same as always. We held it at our house, had held it at our house every year since my mother's knees made hosting difficult. 12 people around 2 tables pushed together in the dining room, the kind of meal that takes 2 days to prepare and is consumed in 40 minutes and discussed warmly for weeks. Claire cooked with my mother, which they both genuinely enjoyed, and I handled the logistics, extra chairs from the basement, the folding table from the garage, Lily underfoot the entire time, in a fever of excitement over the cousins who would arrive. Derek got there early. He always got there early, which I'd always attributed to his particular restlessness, an inability to arrive on time without overcorrecting. He came in through the back door with a bottle of wine and a 6-pack, kissed my mother on the cheek, shook my hand, crouched down to say something to Lily that made her shriek with laughter. Claire was at the stove, stirring gravy. She said, without turning, "Hey, Derek. Glasses are in the cabinet." And Derek said, "I remember." It was 4 words. I remember. The kind of thing you'd say to someone whose house you'd been in before, which, of course, he had. He'd been in our kitchen a dozen times. But there was a familiarity in it that registered somewhere below thought, like a floorboard that sounds different underfoot without your being able to say why. I didn't pursue it. The afternoon unfolded the way Thanksgivings do, layered and loud, punctuated by the particular drama of family proximity. My aunt had a conflict with my uncle that everyone pretended not to notice. My mother told the same story about a Thanksgiving from 1987 that everyone had heard and no one stopped her from telling. Lily appointed herself the official greeter of second helpings and took her role with absolute seriousness. I watched Derek and Claire from across the table. They ate and talked and passed dishes, and if you had been looking for something, you would have found nothing. A normal cadence. Easy conversation. 2 people who liked each other in the uncomplicated way that in-laws and extended family like each other. Nothing louder than warmth. Nothing to photograph and frame as evidence. But there was one moment, small, easy to dismiss. Claire leaned over to take the cranberry sauce from Derek's end of the table, and Derek said something low, under the noise of the room, and Claire's expression changed for exactly 1 second, not a smile, something quieter, more private, before she reassembled herself and passed the dish to my mother. The whole thing lasted less than 3 seconds. She was sitting 2 seats from me. I was watching because I happened to be watching. I felt something cold drop through the center of my chest. I'm still not sure what I actually saw. Later I would tell myself it was imagination, projection, paranoia born from weeks of small accumulated static. But the body knows things the mind refuses to name. My body knew something in that moment, some ancient, animal part of me that had been tracking data I wasn't consciously processing. After dinner, while the women cleared plates and the kids ran through the house, Derek and I stood on the back deck in the cold with our drinks. We talked about a build he was finishing, about Ohio State season, about whether my father-in-law's health was actually improving. It was the easiest conversation I'd had all week. Derek was warm and funny and direct, and I liked him, I had always liked him, and standing there in the cold I felt the morning's cold drop recede into ordinary doubt. He caught my eye at one point and said, "You guys seem good." "We are," I said. He nodded, looked at his drink, said nothing more. I replayed that nod for days. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Claire told me she was starting a pottery class on Tuesday evenings. She'd mentioned wanting to take 1 month earlier, had actually shown me a flyer she'd picked up at the community center, so when she said she'd finally signed up I had no reason to question it. I said that was great. She seemed pleased that I said it was great. She bought clay tools I saw sitting in a bag by the door. The first Tuesday she came home smelling of something earthy and looked genuinely tired, and Lily wanted to see what she'd made and Claire laughed and said it was still wet, it wasn't ready yet, she'd bring it home next week. She came home from the second Tuesday with clay under her fingernails. I am not certain, even now, exactly when the clay became a cover and when it was still true. What I know is that somewhere in those Tuesday evenings, something was happening that I wasn't being told about. And I know that I started staying awake after she fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, trying to turn I remember into nothing. It wouldn't turn. I didn't go looking for proof so much as I stopped looking away. It's a meaningful difference. I hadn't become a detective, I had simply stopped doing the active work of not noticing. The first concrete thing I found was not on her phone, not in her purse, not anywhere dramatic. It was in the recycling bin under the kitchen sink, in early December, when I was breaking down cardboard, a receipt from a restaurant in Medina, a town 30 miles from Harrowfield, dated a Tuesday 3 weeks prior. The time stamp was 7:48 p.m. The pottery class ran from 6 to 8. She would have had to leave early to make it there by 7:48. I stood in the kitchen holding the receipt for a long time. It was from a place called Alderley's, a wine bar, according to a Google search I did immediately on my phone. Not a chain, not incidental, not the kind of place you stop at on the way home. The kind of place you plan. The receipt was for 2 glasses of wine and a charcuterie board. I put it back in the recycling. Smoothed it. Told myself there were 15 explanations. I tried to find them. Spent the next 3 days constructing scenarios, a colleague from work she'd run into, an old friend passing through, something for Sandra, something she'd mentioned offhandedly that I'd forgotten. I built explanations the way you build walls, one plausible brick on top of another until the thing you're trying not to see is behind them. And then I found the name. It wasn't hidden. That's what still gets me, how unhidden it was. I'd been using Claire's car while mine was in the shop, and I went to plug in the GPS address for a job site and the recent destinations were still in the queue. The top one was an address in Medina. I didn't recognize it. On a whim, a dark whim, the kind you regret either way, I looked it up. It was a residential address. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes without starting the car. Then I searched the address through the county property records, which are public, which took 30 seconds. The house was owned by a Derek Hall. My cousin's last name is Hale. Close enough to make my hands go still. I told myself it was different. 1 letter. I told myself that for 2 days while something in me calcified. On the 3rd day I drove to Medina. I didn't plan to confront anything. I told myself I just needed to know if the address was his, to confirm or eliminate, like closing a circuit. The house was a ranch on a quiet street with a contractor's truck in the driveway. White. A ladder rack on the roof of the cab. The same truck I'd watched Derek load his tools into a dozen times. I sat across the street for 5 minutes. Then I drove home. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Didn't tell my brother, didn't call a friend. I sat on it the way you sit on something that hasn't fully taken shape yet, something you're still hoping will resolve into something other than what it looks like. The following Tuesday, I told Claire I had a late meeting and asked my mother to watch Lily. Then I drove to Medina and parked on a side street 2 blocks from Derek's house and waited. Her car was in the driveway by 6:15. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a wave or a blow, it seeps in, cold and thorough, filling every available space. I sat in my truck in the dark for a long time. The radio was off. Porch light on across the street. A dog barking somewhere down the block. All of it impossibly ordinary. I thought about the 4th of July. The way she'd said he seems good lately, with that particular proprietary knowledge in her voice that I'd registered and immediately released. I thought about the Tuesday nights, the clay under her nails, the receipt, I remember, the cranberry dish, all of it settling into a single shape that I had been refusing to look at directly for weeks. I had not been missing it. I had been allowing it to remain unnamed. There is a difference, and it costs something to admit. I drove home before she did. Read Lily's bedtime story, kissed her head, made tea, sat at the kitchen table. When Claire came in at 8:40 she was bright-eyed and slightly flushed from the cold, and she showed me photos on her phone, a bowl she said she'd made, slightly lopsided, the clay actually present under one fingernail. I looked at the photos. I nodded. I said it looked great. She kissed my cheek on the way to the bathroom. I sat very still. The thing about having confirmation is that it doesn't simplify anything. You think it will, you think knowing will convert the anxiety into something actionable. But what it actually does is remove the last exit. Before you know, you can still choose not to know. After, the choice is gone, and all that's left is what to do with the truth. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. What I did know, sitting at that table listening to the pipes run as Claire showered, was that I was not the same man who had driven to Medina 3 weeks ago hoping to be wrong. I chose a Sunday. Not strategically, Sundays were simply when we were most ourselves, most unguarded, when the performance of the week dropped and we were just two people in a house with a child and coffee and the slow morning hours. I wanted to do it when she had nowhere to hide behind the busyness of Tuesday nights and dental appointments and pottery that may or may not have been real. Lily was at my mother's for the afternoon. I'd arranged it 2 days prior without telling Claire the reason. We were in the kitchen. She was reading something on her tablet, cup of tea steaming at her elbow. I had been standing at the window looking at the yard for longer than I realized until she said, "You okay?" I turned around. I said, "I know about Derek." The tablet dropped. Not knocked, fell from fingers that had gone suddenly unreliable. It landed face up on the table with a sound that cracked through the kitchen. She stared at me. Her face went through 4 expressions in 3 seconds, something I can only describe as a collapse in stages, like a building floor by floor. "Nathan." "How long?" I said. Not a question. A request for a specific number. She put both hands flat on the table. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and unwrought in a way that was somehow worse than tears would have been, since July. July. The 4th of July. The back deck. He seems good lately. I had been standing 5 feet from its beginning. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, not because composure is heroic, but because there was nothing to shout. The thing I'd been dreading had already happened. The volume of my response wouldn't change its shape. I pulled out a chair and sat down and looked at her across the table the way I'd looked at her across 1,000 dinners, and I asked the questions you ask because you need the geography of the thing even when you don't want it. "Did you love him?" She looked at her hands. "I don't know." "Did he know what he was doing to me?" A pause. "Yes." "Was any of it real, us, this year, the lake trip, any of it?" Her eyes came up then, and she said, "That was real. All of that was real." And I believe she believed it. I'm still not sure what I believe about it. What emerged over the next 2 hours was the particular archaeology of a secret, the layers peeling back in order, the fuller shape becoming visible beneath the one you thought you were looking at. The pottery class had been real, briefly. 3 Tuesdays. Then it had become a convenient structure to borrow. Derek's house in Medina was where he'd moved when he sold his Harrowfield apartment in September, something he hadn't mentioned when he called me about the surveyor, something I had no way to connect. The dinner in Medina that left the receipt had been their first time out together, Claire told me, the rest had been at his house. "You were in his house," I said. "Yes." "On Thanksgiving," I said, "you were sitting at my table." She flinched. "I sat across from you," I said. "I passed you the bread." She didn't answer. There's a line past which explanation becomes inadequate, not because it's insufficient but because the question it's answering isn't actually the real question. The real question isn't how or when or even why. The real question, the one I couldn't ask out loud, was, "Who are you, and who have I been living with?" I sat with that question in the room for a long time. She cried eventually. Not immediately, not performatively, late in the conversation, quietly, with the particular grief of someone who has broken something they didn't fully intend to break. She said she was sorry. She said she'd ended it. She said she knew she had no right to ask anything of me, but she was asking anyway, "Don't leave." She said Lily in a tone that was not a weapon and not a manipulation, just a word that contained everything. I looked at my hands. I said I needed time. That was the honest answer. I needed time to find out whether I still had a self that could hold this truth and remain intact inside the marriage. I wasn't sure. I suspected, with something close to certainty, that I did not, but I wasn't ready to say that yet, because I was still the man who had coached Saturday soccer and grilled in the cold and believed that effort and decency were sufficient armor, and I needed a few days to let that man understand what had happened to him. She slept in the guest room that night. I lay in our bed listening to the house and thinking about Derek, thinking about him specifically, not in anger but in something stranger, a deep, grinding bewilderment that the person I had trusted to be kin had made the same choice, had sat across from me at Thanksgiving and handed me the rolls and looked me in the eye without visible difficulty. That betrayal lived in a different room from the one Claire occupied. It was quieter and, in some ways, darker. I didn't call him. I haven't called him since. I have nothing to say to him that would accomplish anything, and silence is the only thing I can give him that he doesn't deserve to interpret as forgiveness. Claire stayed. I want to be precise about this. She stayed, and I let her stay, and for 8 weeks in January and February I tried, genuinely, without theater, with every honest intention I had, to see if I was capable of something called forgiveness. We went to a therapist. Dr. Elaine Marsh, twice a week, an office on Calvert Street with a rubber plant by the window and a clock that ticked more loudly than seemed possible in a quiet room. I went because I had decided that if the marriage was going to end, it would not end because I hadn't tried. I have a particular relationship with trying, it's where I keep my self-respect. Claire went with a quality of attention that was almost painful to watch. She answered every question fully. She didn't defend herself or deflect. She did the work with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she took seriously, and I recognized her in it, and recognition made everything more complicated. For 6 weeks, I thought it might be possible. There was one evening in late January, Lily asleep, the house quiet, snow falling outside the kitchen window, when Claire and I sat at the table with tea and talked for 3 hours about things we had never talked about, the accumulated silences of 9 years, the places where I had retreated into work and stopped asking, the places where she had stopped expecting me to ask. It was the most honest conversation of our marriage. I went to bed that night thinking, maybe. Maybe. But maybe is not the same as yes, and I kept learning that in small specific ways. The Wednesday Derek's name came up in a context I couldn't control. My uncle mentioned he was doing a renovation in Medina, casually, over the phone, and I felt the cold drop again, the same one from Thanksgiving, and it didn't diminish the way it was supposed to. I had thought that understanding would metabolize the pain. It didn't. It just gave the pain better language. In therapy, Dr. Marsh said something I have turned over many times since: forgiveness is not a decision. It's a condition. You can decide to pursue it, but you can't decide to have it. I couldn't make the condition happen. I tried. It didn't come. I reached out to Derek exactly once. Not by phone. A text, which felt right for what it was: I know everything. Don't contact this family again. He texted back, 40 minutes later, a single word: understood. I don't know what he felt. I find that I don't particularly need to. The conversation with Claire happened in early March. Lily was at school. We sat in the living room rather than the kitchen. Some instinct in me wanted different furniture for different weight. I told her that I had tried, that the trying had been real, that I was grateful she had also tried, that none of it had produced what needed to be produced. I told her I was not angry, or rather, the anger had passed through something and come out the other side as something quieter, something I didn't have a word for except done. She wept. Not the quiet grief of the first conversation, this was harder, the kind of crying that comes when the thing you hoped for collapses without drama. She said she understood. She said she'd known, she thought, for a while. She said she was sorry again, and this time the sorry had a different texture, less about what she'd done, more about what it had cost, which is the sorriest kind of sorry there is. We told Lily in the most careful, plainest language we could find. Mom and Dad love you completely. We are both still your parents. We are going to live in different places, but you are going to see both of us all the time. Lily looked at us both very seriously and said, "Will Biscuit come to both places?" Biscuit being the neighbor's dog she considered honorary family. Claire smiled through tears. I said, "Yeah, buddy. We'll work it out with Biscuit." And Lily seemed satisfied. I moved into a rental across town in April. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, a kitchen with a window that faced east. I put Lily's drawings on the refrigerator the first week, the whole gallery, every portrait she'd made, and stood back and looked at them for a long time. She'd drawn me with my truck in the background, like I said. She'd drawn Claire with her hair exactly right. She'd drawn a version of Thanksgiving with everyone seated around a table, 12 small figures in pencil and crayon. Derek is there, in the drawing. Third from the left. 6-year-olds don't know what to erase. I left it up. It's still there. I decided that life doesn't require me to edit everything that hurts. The spring was slow and quiet in the way that honest springs are, nothing romantic about it, just longer days and the gradual return of ordinary life in its actual dimensions. I cooked in my kitchen. I took Lily to soccer, which started up again in April, and I coached on the alternate weeks, and the week that wasn't mine I watched from the sideline with the other parents, and it was strange and it was fine. We built a routine, Claire and I, that was more functional than most routines built in the wreckage of what ours had been. We were, eventually, civil. Occasionally even warm, in the blunt way of people who have been through something and come out with a particular mutual respect for the honesty of the ending. In June, I drove to Lake Erie on a Friday, alone, no plan, just the truck and the radio and the familiar highway. I stayed at a motel near the same stretch of water where we'd taken Lily the summer before. Walked the shore in the evening. The water was cold and the light was flat and enormous, that particular Lake Erie light that has no shadows and makes everything look very clear. I stood there for a while, just watching the water. I had spent years being good at the wrong things, at keeping the peace, at not asking, at smoothing surfaces. I had called that stability. I had called that strength. What it was, I understand now, was a preference for the appearance of a good thing over the reality of understanding it. That preference has a cost, and I paid it, and I'd rather have paid it than continued not knowing it was there. I don't know if I'll try again, marriage, that particular form of trust. Not yet. What I know is that the question itself doesn't frighten me the way it would have before. Something in me that was fragile has been replaced with something more honest, less polished, more load-bearing. I'll take that. Lily called me that evening from Claire's, just to say good night, which she sometimes does when I'm away. "Are you at the water, Daddy?" "Yeah," I said. "At the lake. Is it pretty?" I looked out at the gray-blue water and the light going flat and gold at the edge of it. "Yeah," I said. "It's pretty." "Okay," she said. "Good night." And I stood there a little longer, watching the lake, and something settled. What this story reveals, beneath the betrayal itself, is something subtler and more uncomfortable, the architecture of willful peace. Nathan was not a passive man. He was attentive, capable, emotionally present by most visible measures. What he practiced, quietly and over years, was a specific kind of restraint that he'd coded as respect, the decision not to ask certain questions, not to press certain silences, not to disturb the smooth surface of a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like what he'd wanted. He had confused non-interference with security. And in doing so, he had built a marriage that was, in some structural sense, unmonitored. Claire's affair did not emerge from nothing. That is not an excuse, it is an observation about how trust erodes in relationships where conflict is perpetually deferred. The pottery class detail is instructive precisely because it was real before it became a lie. There was a version of that Tuesday night that was exactly what it claimed to be. The deception grew out of an existing landscape of independence, existing habits of not reporting, existing patterns where Claire moved through her week and Nathan didn't ask, and both of them called that a comfortable marriage. By the time the lie needed infrastructure, the infrastructure already existed. What is harder to sit with is Derek. The cousin occupies a particular moral position in the story, more corrosive in some ways than the affair itself, because it violates a category of trust that has no repair. A marriage can, in principle, survive infidelity if both people are willing to do the architecture of rebuilding. What cannot be rebuilt, in any livable form, is the family table. Derek sat at Thanksgiving and passed the rolls. He knew exactly what he was doing. His single-word response to Nathan's final text, "understood," is not the response of a person who didn't understand. It's the response of a person who had, all along, simply decided the understanding didn't apply to him. The accumulation that broke the marriage was not the affair alone. It was the layering of small unreckoned distances over years, Nathan's habit of not asking, Claire's habit of not explaining, Derek's easy place in the family's warmth, until those distances created enough shadow for something to grow in. Each of them contributed to the conditions. Only two of them made choices within those conditions that cannot be undone. What Nathan arrived at, alone on a Lake Erie shoreline in June, is not triumph. It is something quieter and more durable, a clear account of himself. He tried forgiveness and found its limits. He did not force those limits to be other than they were. That honesty, the willingness to say "I tried and it was not enough" rather than performing either martyrdom or resilience, is the thing that will carry him forward. Not healed, exactly. Reoriented. The marriage ended not with a revelation but with an accumulation, the way most real things end, not at the moment of maximum drama but at the quiet moment when a person becomes unable to pretend the gap between what was and what is can still be closed. What stays with me about this story isn't the betrayal itself, it's the Thanksgiving table. 12 people, 2 tables pushed together, a 6-year-old taking second helping orders, and somewhere in the middle of it, a secret that 2 people shared openly enough that a receipt ended up in the recycling and a name was saved in recent GPS destinations. There's something about that proximity, how close deception and ordinary life can sit to each other without touching, that I find genuinely disturbing. We talk about red flags as if they're obvious. They rarely are. They're quiet. They fit. They slide into the shape of a Tuesday night or a forward sentence or the particular angle a screen tilts away from you. The question isn't whether you were paying attention. The question is whether you allowed yourself to finish the thought. Sometimes the most courageous thing is to follow an uncomfortable observation all the way to the end, even when the end costs you something. Nathan learned that. Slowly, honestly, and at a real price. That's what growth actually looks like.